We are looking at a landscape, by which I mean it's a picture of the land. What do you think you'd call a painting of the sea? What would you call a painting of a city? Yeah, absolutely right. You've got seascapes and you've got cityscapes. And when I'm looking at a landscape, I find it useful to divide the artwork into sections. Think about which part of the painting is furthest away. It's the part at the top, isn't it? Which is what we call the background. Which part's closest to you? Which part are you, the viewer, invited to stand in? It's the bottom, and that's what we would call the foreground. And then the section in the middle, you've guessed it, is called the middle ground. This is an artwork by a very famous painter, and the painter's name is Claude Monet, and he was working in the late 1800s in France and was one of a group of artists who were known as the Impressionists. Up until then, the artwork in Europe had been a lot more like the Napoleon that we looked at earlier, a lot more realistic, almost like a photograph, as we said before. And then you had this group of artists who, rather than trying to create an exact replica of what they were looking at, were very clearly just creating an impression. And if you imagine yourself holding a paintbrush, have a think about how you would use it. What kind of marks would you be making on the canvas? And what you'll come up with is probably a lot of these kind of sharp, flicky movements. Let's have a look at the content of Monet's painting. It's a church, and you can see the church spire at the topmost point of the painting. Underneath that we can see the roofs of the houses, we can see the trees. And then things start to change a bit, because here, this line is the edge of the water. And you can see the green paint flicks here are the trees reflected. See the terracotta pinks and creams, there's the roofs reflected. And right here at the bottom, the mirror image of the church. So where would Monet have stood to paint an artwork like this? Well, I don't know if this is what he was standing on to paint the church, but I know that he had made a pontoon, a floating platform on which he kept his easel and his paints, and he would anchor the pontoon in the river so that he could draw the land from the water. Hang on to that idea of those paint flicks that are so typical of the Impressionist painters, because we're going to look at a modern work of art which links in now. So here we are at another landscape, and you can probably see by comparing it to the size of me that this is on a much larger scale, and this work is unframed. I don't think we looked at the label on the Monet, but here, as with the Monet, it is also an oil on canvas, and it is a landscape. In the background, the sky and the mountains. In the middle ground, more mountains, and in the foreground you can see the spikes of the trees. And normally when I show children this artwork, the first thing they want to say to me is that it looks just like Minecraft. When I ask them what that means, they point out that it's very pixelated. The pixels are the individual parts of a photograph, a computer image, and when that image is enlarged, especially if it's not very good quality, you will get these pixels, these squares. But this isn't a photograph. We know that this is oil on canvas, and it's by an artist called Dan Hayes. Why has he chosen to individually, painstakingly paint these pixels? Well, I'm going to take you back to where this artwork comes from. Dan Hayes searched on the internet for his own name. And when he searched it, apparently, this is how the story goes, he didn't just find out about himself, he found out about another Dan Hayes who lived in America. And this other Dan Hayes had lots of pictures, lots of slightly pixelated pictures, I believe, of the Colorado landscape. Dan Hayes, the artist, decided to recreate them painstakingly. And if we look at the title of this work is Colorado Impressions number 12A. I think it's possible to see the individual pixels in this artwork in the same way as those individual flicks of paint in the Monet, and Impressionism for the 21st century.